Hello again and welcome back to our class. I hope you had a wonderful weekend and I'm so happy to be back starting week 5 with you. Thank you so much for your work last week, submitting your community needs reflections and also the revision comments. I was also appreciative of your completing the online verification skills, thinking through some of the standards that Mike Caulfield outlines in terms of online literacy, thinking carefully about the rhetorical situations we encounter on various websites when we're researching. This week, we're going to be collecting more research, thinking carefully and returning again to our research questions that we began in our Padlet, and really thinking about ways to sharpen, modify, and tailor that research question as we continue to read more about our topics. Before we jump in though, I wanted to say a quick thank you to Hope, who created this wonderful class banner, which will be across our page for this week and the following week, which is spring break. Thank you so much, and please click on our weeks folder and click on week 5. I'll be continuing to read through your revisions this week, leaving you final comments, as well as your online verification skills form. I hope to check back in on Wednesday with feedback on the ways that you've completed those assignments and sort of hit some of the highlights. In the meantime, I'd like to welcome you to week 5, where we're going to be thinking carefully about what research exists about the questions we're asking, and how do we determine what kinds of sources we want to read and select for what will be our project number 2, an annotated bibliography. Our course objectives outline for us where we are in our class, and this week you'll notice that there are so many of them highlighted. We're going to be thinking about the research process, as I demonstrate in this graphic below, continuing to do background research, continuing to create a search strategy, which means thinking about specific keywords, thinking about our research question and continuing to revise that research question, and then finding sources and evaluating sources. Specifically this week, we're going to be thinking about the relationship between finding sources and evaluating sources. What does evaluate mean, and how do we do that when we're reading our sources? I return to our map, a sort of graphic orientation, figuring the ways in which we're moving through this class. We've completed our reflections, thinking about our communities, coming up with organic topics, and things that we're really interested in learning more about. Next is time to think about what kinds of research exists beyond our own personal experiences and reflections, things that other people have to say about our topics and have researched before. This is when we start to analyze our sources and think critically about those voices. As we begin week 5, I want us to look ahead and see that next week actually is going to be spring break. So as we work on the content for this week, you'll see that most of the due dates are set for Friday. And that's because I want to give you enough time to do that work, and also some time to think about if you need to do any catching up or want to get ahead over spring break. Please see our weeks folder, where I've included a spring break folder where there is additional content that we will cover in week 6, but I've allowed you to sort of review and focus on over spring break if you have time to do that. If not, no problem at all, but I know some of you are excited to sort of get ahead and jump into the next week. 2 of our course objectives talk about this thing called a discourse community. Analyze a rhetorical situation within a discourse community, and also identify an issue relevant to a discourse community, a research question, a research plan, and digital or print media and genres in which to present research findings to an audience. But what is a discourse community? If you scroll down into our folder, you'll see that I have a Google slide deck called What is a Discourse Community? See specifically slides 1 through 7, where I include some content on this particular feature. In 1990, John Swales, who's a leading figure in discourse community theory, notes that a discourse community shares 6 characteristics. It has a broadly agreed set of common public goals, has ways to communicate among its members, uses tools and methods of communication to provide information and feedback. It uses 1 or more genres, email, phone meetings, communicate further its aims, has an acquired special lexis, or words and vocabulary that they use, and the members have a suitable degree of expertise. So what do all these features add up to? Basically, it's a group of people who share values and assumptions and ways of communicating. For instance, the medical school application will be read by a discourse community of physicians and medical staff who understand its values and will evaluate applicants based on those values. The importance of thinking about discourse communities in this class is that it has practical application beyond it. When we write, it's useful to think in terms of the discourse community we're participating in and whose members we are addressing. The final part and project of this class will be to write a letter for change. We're going to be addressing a specific discourse community, and so in order to have that particular discourse community in mind, we need to think about what our topic lends itself to, what group of people are interested in that question we're asking. What does that group assume? What kinds of questions do they ask, and what counts as evidence? Likewise, it's helpful to think in terms of the genres we encounter in a given discourse community and the ways we can compose within them, whether that's an email, a text, a Facebook post, a TikTok video. What might be an example of a discourse community? Well, here's a very specific example of someone who is interested in the video game community. And this particular person, Alicia, made something more specific in terms of a particular Dungeons and Dragons campaign called the Kapumi Empire. And so she shares with us the sort of characteristics of the discourse community and says, the shared goal is to defeat the king's pride and the cult of the Queen Mother. Again, this is specific jargon from the Dungeons and Dragons campaign. What kinds of intercommunication does this group use, this discourse community use? Group text, Zoom, Google Docs. And so you'll see we can break this down, a specific discourse community, into those features. How do they provide feedback? They have session recaps, group texts after the session. They use genres to achieve their goals by using creatures, classes, power sets from D&D 5th edition, Kapumi history, and lore. What kinds of words do they use? Escagruel, Queen Mother, Platinum Dragon, all of those are specific to this particular discourse community. And is there kind of a variation in terms of the membership? There are novices, there's people that are intermediate players, and expert players. This week I'd like you to return to your research question and really think about one discourse community that might communicate your project to for real change. Remember that these audiences can include any discourse community that has a broadly agreed set of public common goals. So some examples of discourse communities in the professional field might be emergency room nurses, prison guards, political aides. Be careful to sufficiently narrow your focus so you're not trying to analyze a community with millions of members who have vastly different discourse practices. For example, scientists or business people. Way too broad. Instead, elect for something more specific. Some societal instances of discourse community might be activist organizations, specific ethnic groups, campus club organization, charity organizations. In the civic realm, PTA or similar school groups, political action groups, and sort of cultural groups, fan groups, Civil War reenactors, game clubs, Dungeons and Dragons, etc. Of course, most of you knew this was coming. I'm going to ask you to complete a Google form, basically a way for us to practice drafting with each other. It's a nice way of collecting this information. What is your discourse community? Just complete this 25-point drafting thinking to brainstorm ways that we can take your topic and think about it in terms of applying to a discourse community. I want us to return to our Padlet from last week and think about what is a research question that you've really inspired by. Some of you offered a couple, so either condense them into one or just select one of those questions that you're most connected to. I want you to think about a discourse community and what might be one specific local discourse community that would be interested in your research topic. Remember, we don't want a group that has millions of people. Let's try to narrow it down to a smaller group, a group that we might have a larger influence on. Again, returning to this definition of discourse community, what is your discourse community's broadly agreed set of common public goals? A lot of times you can find that in about sections of websites. If there isn't a clear definition of that, maybe you can summarize what those specific goals are, but typically discourse communities have those stated. How does your discourse community communicate among its members? Can you email them? Phone calls? Do they have weekly meetings? What are the ways in which this communication is exchanged? And remember, it's not top down, but the community can talk back and forth to one another. What kind of genres do they use to communicate and further its aims? Does your discourse community use one or more genres? And just click yes or no. Hopefully it's yes, because it does need more than one genre to communicate. And then explain some specific words related to your discourse community. Do the members have a suitable degree of expertise? Describe what levels of expertise exist in your community, from novice to expert. It's important that we start to think about a potential audience as not just me, but more importantly, people that are directly related to your research question. I want your research to have real-world application, and so thinking about this discourse community early on will help us not only shape what kinds of sources we're reading, but how we describe these sources and communicate them to that particular discourse community. I have here an example I'd like you to read by Wednesday of a group of people who share values and assumptions and ways of communicating. A discourse community, in other words. In this reading, the discourse community is the Lawndale Christian Development Corporation in Chicago's North Lawndale neighborhood. But the ideas are shared with the NPR WBEZ reader community. And so as you read through this article called Community Groups Push a Bold Idea to Revitalize Some Chicago Neighborhoods, I want us to think about that discourse community. What kinds of work are they doing, and how do they describe their particular mission to this audience of NPR WBEZ readers? In addition, I want you to think about the ways this community presents its discourse community features. Does it have a broadly agreed set of common goals that are apparent in the article? Does it have ways of communicating among its members? Do they use specific methods of communication to provide information and feedback to one another? Do they have an acquired set of special words or vocabulary? And do they have a suitable degree of expertise? Can we gauge that from this particular article? Again, the readings in this class are always supposed to in some way parallel what we're doing on our own projects. It's supposed to model for us ways in which we can think about discourse communities working, communicating, and impacting change. Your second major task this week is to think about the sources that you're reading, the sources that you're collecting, and how closely related they are to your research question. Does your research question need to shift or change in any way as a result of what you're reading? Hopefully, yes. This week we're going to be thinking about drafting an annotation. In other words, a way to notate and to analyze carefully the things that we're reading about our topic. So over the next few weeks, we're going to be reading, researching, and collecting, which I think is so exciting. We're going to be collecting the best sources connected to our research questions, and eventually we'll collect 5 of the best sources out of all of the ones that we've read and analyzed and assessed. But first, for this week, I want us to practice just writing one annotation. I'm going to give you feedback and comments on that particular annotation before you continue to collect, read, and write the next 4. So by Friday, what I'd like you to do is please review our prompt, which I'll discuss in just a moment. I want you to create a new page on your ePortfolio and share with us your sample annotation, complete with a link to the source you're annotating. Now, this source probably should come from your online verification skills from last week, the one that you shared with me as part of your research. Remember, you thought about the purpose and the exigence and the context of that particular source. And so that source is perhaps the one that you'd like to annotate, maybe the one that most closely reflects your research question. But I want you to share it with us as part of your ePortfolio page, as we had done in weeks 1 and 2, by creating a new page on your existing site, complete with a clear research question and potentially your discourse community at the top of that page. I want you to also label your Composition Corner entry by the topic so that interested students may find your post easier. So when you create your thread, please make sure to label it appropriately. The subject here should reflect the topic that you're posting on. Please click on Video 1 Part 2 for Week 5, where I go into more detail on what exactly we're going to be doing in terms of data collection and putting together of the longer annotated bib over the coming weeks.